Welcome to another episode of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, and today I'm super lucky to be here with Gordon Galzerano, who's the president and CEO of SEMA. Prior to that, Gordon was out here with the rest of us as an independent consultant for a while and spent time as a senior director with Cisco. Gordon, welcome to the show.
Brian, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So today's topic is disrupt or be disrupted. Sounds like an idle threat of some sort, but it is actually, having looked at some of your writing on this, it is. So yeah, Gordon, you and I were chatting last week about, and it always sounds cliche to me, but the speed of change right now, right? Like how quickly everything's happening. And one of my favorite books that our watchers, listeners know about is a book written by Rita Hunter McGrath called The End of Competitive Advantage. And Professor McGrath says we have to now learn to compete on a series of short-term transient advantages. And to me, that one quote out of the whole book sort of makes it come alive. But so let's start with this. Why do companies need to disrupt or be disrupted? Aren't there some that sort of chug along and keep doing the same old thing forever?
Well, that was probably true several years back, but I think because of a lot of what's gone on over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, no company nor any industry is exempt from the risk of disruption. And they have a choice. They can be disruptors or they can be disrupted. And we'll talk, I'm sure, about some of the companies that have experienced that disruption in the past.
Yeah.
I think for context, Brian, if I could, just to kind of set the stage on, as you outlined my background, the best way to think about who I've become is an individual that's always sat at the intersection between business and technology. And it's why this topic is so important, is because having grown up in the IT industry, although I'm not a technologist, I was always curious about how companies across industries and geography could use technology in a purposeful way to achieve outcomes that they wanted to achieve. So inherently, I got caught up in the tornado, if you will, of disruption and was part of an industry that was incredibly disruptive, the IT industry. So I think it's a good context for how we landed on this topic today and a little bit about kind of the why behind the what as we get into the discussion. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Yeah, keep going.
No, so I was going to say, as you and I were talking last week, organizations have a choice, really. They can be disruptors or they can become disrupted. And I also work with this bold premise that every company is becoming a technology company. I'm not suggesting that they're becoming an IT company, but what I am saying is technology is a core arrow in the quiver of being able to really transform and at the pace of change, be able to adapt and be flexible because organizations have to do that. And so no company is exempt, like I said earlier, in any industry. And there's been so many examples through time of how disruption happened 5 years ago with COVID. And that had a global impact on supply chain, us as consumers, educators, and so forth. And now I think we're seeing it again in 2025 with the headwinds related to global and economic and political headwinds that are causing a lot of organizations today to pause. Yep. So I think the conditions, again, are presenting themselves where organizations have to think about how do they adapt, become flexible, and most importantly, become resilient during times of uncertainty.
It's what comes to mind when you talk about every company is a technology company. I was listening to NPR last week, and they were interviewing a guy who runs a tractor driving school. So I had this notion in my head, Gordon, of what we might all have. The old tractor. I live near Wisconsin, and I see them out there in the fields, and I have a vision of the human driving that tractor. The whole discussion was about technology and AI. These tractors are now full of AI, and it's really cool actually because they're looking at the plants and they're projecting crop yield. And so this whole story about a tractor driving school was so heavily tied to technology. So I completely agree with you. So we'll talk about the good news in a moment, but what are some examples of companies who didn't, and sort of maybe why they didn't evolve, why they didn't disrupt, and they got disrupted?
Sure. There are so many, I think, examples that we would know, and I'll use some of those examples because I think it speaks truth to use cases of companies that had choice. They could have been disruptors, but they allowed themselves to become disrupted based on 7 characteristics. And I'll talk about those briefly. But first, I think there are 3 key aspects of why disruption is happening today and has happened over time. First, the proliferation of technology. For years, companies have been looking to digitize their business from analog to digital. And as a result, that has yielded a tremendous amount of data and information about their organizations, about their markets, about their customers, partners, etc. The sticking point was, okay, we've got all of this information. What do we do with it? How do we put it to work?
Yeah.
And up until AI, it has been predominantly a play of using that data to inform our decision making, where now the pivot and the proliferation around AI is now about how can it help us do decision making and predictive modeling based on where our customers, our partners, our ecosystem relationships are trying to go. So that first disruptor around the proliferation of technology is what's really causing that to be an accelerated motion. The second key contributor is that we know to be true that customer decision making is shifting. Expectations are shifting because they're becoming more informed. They've had to adapt. They've had to be more agile and flexible. And therefore, they have to look at suppliers and strategic partners that can keep up with that pace of change and help them understand what's next. And then third, agile competitors, either existing competitors that have been willing to disrupt themselves
Yeah.
or new entrants into a marketplace where they don't have all the legacy baggage and they can leapfrog over legacy competitors. So those are 3
Yep.
distinct examples. Now, if we look at examples, let's talk about Kodak. It's a very, very well-known documented use case going back in time. And if you think about Eastman Kodak, they had 90% market share in the 80s. Think about that. That is like unheard of. And in 1996, their revenue peaked at about $16 billion. But then what happened was early in the late 70s, they actually designed the first digital camera. And they had the patent on that camera, and they had an opportunity to bring that to market. But they chose to not do that. Why? Because their cash cow was in film and film production and imaging. So they made a conscious decision to not move to digital because it would have disrupted their cash heavy film and film developing business. But what happened? Competitors started to bring digital technology to market. And in 2001, they saw a dramatic decline in film sales. And 2011, they ultimately ended up filing for Chapter 11.
Well,
Xerox. There's so many companies. Go ahead,
yeah.
Brian.
Well, no, Gordon. What comes to mind is you were quoting a past CEO of Cisco that you need courage to disrupt. And so, as you're talking about Xerox and Kodak, like I'm wondering if there's a connection, because I wanted to ask you. I mean, I think we kind of generally get what that means, but as it relates, did that come into play for those guys?
It did, and what I was going to allude to, because the quote you're thinking of is from John Chambers, and it's a
Yes.
great one because one of the things he said, Brian, was that one of the most important lessons that he learned was that you have to have the courage to disrupt yourself.
Yes.
This means anticipating and capturing market transitions before they occur and having the courage to be out in front of your peers. But to do that, I was referring to why there are 7 characteristics of why organizations struggle is because they're risk averse.
Yeah.
There may be cultural barriers, lack of vision and leadership, short-term focus. I think the Kodak example is one where Why do we need to change? We're doing great. We're profitable. Well, that obviously that landscape changed very quickly. And other things like they're siloed organizationally. So their ability to adapt and change is encumbered by their ineffectual ability to move fast enough. And then market realignment, right? Or misalignment, I should say, where they missed those market transitions. They weren't listening to their customers, and ultimately they ended up getting left behind.
Yeah. So let's talk about sort of the good news, the companies that have done it well. Have they just overcome? I think you said 7 things. Have they overcome? What did they do? Who are those companies, and what did they do to change the world?
Sure, sure. There are three examples I'll give you: Microsoft Azure, AWS, which, as you know, is part of Amazon, and Salesforce. And those three companies, just as examples, have three characteristics that they share in common. They have a culture rooted in innovation. Second, they possess true visionary leadership. In fact, Bezos was even quoted historically as saying, all of the leaders at Amazon think and live in the future. They're encouraged to, and they're always looking at ways to disrupt even their own existing
Mhm.
models. And we know a lot is true about Amazon in that regard. And then third, they focus on partnerships and ecosystem collaboration and alliances. In other words, they don't try to go it alone. They recognize that if they have critical partnerships and ecosystem relationships, that gives them exponential ability to move faster, to leverage expertise in other parts of the business or with other partners, but it also helps them reduce their risk profile. It helps them shield themselves from some of the disruption that happens in the marketplace. So, those three companies in particular are ones that have cracked the code, and they just happen to be in an industry of IT, but also in the consumer, B2B and B2C consumer markets as well.
So I wonder, Gordon, as you're talking about that, what came to mind is the best way I can think about it is like the scale of disruption. There, as a company, you can do a series of small disruptions, right, to pieces of your value proposition or your go-to-market, and then there's that one massive disruption, right? We make a complete shift from this to digital. What are your thoughts on those? Just yeah, are they? They're both important, I
Yeah,
assume.
they're both very important, Brian, and here's why. So look, we're going through these times of uncertainty. And at SAMA, we just came off the heels of our annual conference in Orlando. And our theme this year is the human network. Because during times of uncertainty, there's never a better time to get closer to your customers, to your partners, even if they're not buying today, because you have to look for other ways to create mutual value and innovate. It could be around an idea, it could be a new business model, it could be a transformative what's next idea. But all of those things apply. Those small ideas over time become big ideas. So getting closer to customers and partners, critically important. And through those engagements, being able to look at opportunities to create value and co-create new ways of thinking and so forth. I saw this firsthand when COVID happened. When COVID happened and supply chains were dramatically disrupted, at the time, I was leading my practice around executive advisory boards. And in the consumer packaging space, as you can imagine, there's a lot to be said around supply chain. And what started to happen when we got customers in the room and ideating around what's next, they started to think about resiliency. They started to think about how to leverage one another's capacity so that they can do things that they otherwise couldn't do. And some of those were simple but not simplistic ideas,
Right.
but they had a profound impact on customer experience and the bottom line. And then, of course, when we think about those transformative ideas, I think this whole body of work around agentic AI and so forth, I think the proliferation of that is going to just completely create positive and adverse disruption over the next 5 years in particular.
Yeah, I want to finish with getting into the weeds a little bit, and this will lead into, as you well know, you and I are going to do a podcast on your platform about my previous company I disrupted to build my new one, and we're in the in the sales enablement field, but so I don't want to get into that yet, but I'm just wondering. With being account management focused as you are, or even sales focused, what needs to be disrupted from your perspective in terms of the way we prep our reps, whether they're account managers or AEs?
Yeah, yeah. When I talk to CEOs and C-suite executives, I try to tailor my initial conversations around three things. Tell me about the culture of your company. Tell me about the purpose of why you exist and in
Hmm.
service of who or whom. And then third, how is the customer embedded into the strategy of your company? The customer centricity piece of this. When those three things line up, it then creates a culture and an environment for the customer facing teams, whether it's sales,
Yeah.
marketing, executives, right? To really be able to get out there and have meaningful conversations in the way we're talking about it today, right? And so, what organizations have to think about is how do we enable our customer facing teams, our sellers and sales teams, with the opportunities to actually make a difference.
Yes.
Because we can go out and talk to customers all day long, but if our organization can't adopt the ideas and implement them at scale in a repeatable, monetizable way, it falls flat. So part of what it's, I would consider it a two-dimensional piece. One is how we get our sellers to think strategically, which is not easy. That's one of the characteristics, attributes, and skills that's hardest. People either have it or they don't, or it's much harder to teach how to be a strategic thinker. But when our sellers do have that mindset and they can think about how they can drive the best of their organization in service of their customers, that's when the conditions are the best. What I say to CEOs and executives is you have to create the internal conditions for that to happen. In other words, as I mentioned, one of the seven attributes where why organizations struggle is because they're very siloed. So there has to be an integration or an alignment internally to get those cross functional, interdisciplinary teams created,
Yeah.
aligned, measured towards helping our sellers be effective when they are out there having those strategic conversations with customers and partners.
Yep. I do agree on the sort of implementation and pull through thing, and that's what we'll talk some about on our next podcast, because as I was building my new business, we interviewed 65 CROs, CSOs, heads of sales enablement. Everybody was frustrated. There's a lot of spending going on and a lot of levers being pulled and stuff being pushed to frontline folks. But yeah, the most common frustration I've heard is that it's not sticking. We're not having behavior change. So we'll talk more about that. And so, just a quick aside for I think most people are probably familiar with SAMA, Strategic Account Management Association. And Gordon, you didn't know I was going to do this, and you didn't ask. But many years ago, my first VP job was a VP of National Account Sales for Marriott International. And I didn't know the first thing about account management. And it was back in the day when account management was still reasonably new. And I joined SAMA. It was NAMA at the time, and I just aged the hell out of
Yes,
myself.
yes, you did.
But I sat on the board of SAMA. One of my co-founders has also sat on the board of SAMA, and the amount, if you're running an account management organization or you're an account manager, the content, the contacts, the conversations, it helped me build my entire account management program. I had no clue where I was going. So I thank the community and anybody else who hasn't been there. And also thank you. You've been super gracious with your time prepping for this and generous with your ideas today. And I really, really appreciate you being here.
Brian, it's been my pleasure, and I appreciate the partnership with you and the team. And thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.